Wait. She held up a hand and he paused. Don't tell me. Let me guess. It was fun while it lasted, but now it, whatever it was, is over, and we will never speak of it again. How did I do? I will require you to sign a non-disclosure agreement, he said stiffly, and the words stole the breath right out of her. She felt so outraged, insulted, and, shockingly, hurt. And what if I don't sign it? She asked through stiff lips. I mean, aren't you supposed to sign those things before we do the stuff we're not supposed to disclose? Usually, yes, but we were in bed together before I had a chance to consider the possibility that something sexual might happen between us. We don't suit. You're not my usual. His voice petered off as he grasped that his next words would be in bad taste. Still, he might not have said them, but they hovered between them like an offensive odor. I'm not your usual type, she finished for him. And because of that, you never thought we'd wind up screwing each other's brains out. So you didn't protect yourself the way you normally would have. Do you make all of your lovers sign non-disclosure agreements before you sleep with them? She asked combatively, and his jaw clenched. Usually. The tight one-word answer surprised her. You do? All of them? He seemed to have no shortage of female companions, and the thought of him going through this same distasteful scene with all of them was a little revolting. I don't trust many people, he admitted, and his broad shoulders shifted uncomfortably. That's not a very romantic way to start a relationship, she noted absently, still a bit taken aback by his admission. The women I usually associate with understand the need for privacy. Nobody wants their private lives smeared all over the papers for the titillation of the masses. And you think that's something I would do? She asked, stung. I don't know you, Miss Knight. I don't want to know you. We enjoyed each other, and that's the end of it. What you are or aren't capable of doesn't interest me. I want you to sign the agreement so that I no longer have to consider the possibility that you may one day decide to do a cheeky little sexpose on your tryst with Dante Damaso. Tryst was such an un-Dante-like word for him to use that for a moment she could only gape at him before his words sank in properly. How do I know that you won't be the one to brag to your mates about screwing your secretary? First of all, you're not my secretary, and secondly, this agreement would protect you from such an eventuality. It works both ways. So what happens if I don't sign your agreement? She asked again, trying very hard to disguise the tremble in her voice. Do I lose my job? Your job has never been, and will never be, at stake because of our personal association, he said, the answer coming so quickly that she didn't doubt its veracity. But this gesture would go a long way toward convincing me of your integrity. And yet it does nothing for yours. She could see that he didn't like the idea of his integrity being called into question. He tugged at his cuffs and straightened his already immaculate tie before launching another volley at her. You sign it and you have the comfort of knowing that none of this ever gets out. That your brother and friends never discover how very quickly you fell into bed with me. He played dirty, and for a second she almost fell for his bluff. Why would you tell anybody about this when you just admitted that you don't want it to come out? She asked skeptically. Also, I'm a consenting adult, and you're not my first sexual partner. I'm pretty sure my brother and friends don't have any misconceptions about me. But they don't think you're an easy little slut either, do they? She could feel the blood draining from her face at the question. She struggled to breathe as the emotional impact of that sucker punch nearly caused her to double over in shock and pain. Why did this hurt? It shouldn't hurt. He meant nothing to her. He didn't have the power to hurt her. And yet, there was pain. An awful lot of pain. You think I'm a slut? For a fleeting instant, she saw an expression almost like regret flash across his face. I could make it look like you are. He didn't answer her question, not really. But the failure to give her a yes or no was more of an indictment than an actual reply. I could make you look like a scheming, manipulative, money-grubbing little tramp, while I come out smelling like a rose. But if you sign this agreement, you'd be protected from that. We could both go back to our lives none the worse for wear. Failure to sign would force me to play dirty. To go on the offensive, and neither of us wants that. She hated him so much in that instant that she was shaking with it. He had to know how she felt, had to see it in her eyes, but he didn't even flinch, merely held the document out with a steady hand until she took it from him. Cleo tried to read it, but her eyes were blurred with tears she hadn't even known were there. She took the pen from him and signed in the allotted space beside his sprawling signature. She handed both pen and paper back to him with violently shaking hands, wanting nothing more than to get out of his presence and take another shower. "This is for the best, Cleo," he murmured gently, almost regretfully, and she laughed bitterly as she turned away from him. "I would rather you didn't talk to me unless it's work-related, sir. I don't think I could stomach your empty platitudes right now." She retreated to her own room without a backward glance. The return journey to Cape Town felt endless. Dante and Cleo barely exchanged a word between Narita Airport and Cape Town International. They separated in Dubai for much-needed showers in the first-class lounge, and Cleo picked listlessly at some fruit while waiting for the boarding call of their next flight. She didn't see Dante at all between disembarking and boarding in Dubai, and she preferred it that way. The privacy of their first-class suites, which had been new and exciting to Cleo on the way to Tokyo, had merely made the flight back to Cape Town tolerable because she didn't have to see him and could actually manage to squeeze in a few hours of sleep. The cold, windy, and gray weather of Cape Town suited Cleo's mood perfectly. She was moody, exhausted, her knee still hurt, and she just wanted to get home. Dante caught up with her after they had both cleared customs and baggage claim, just before they stepped into the arrivals lounge. He grabbed hold of her elbow and turned her toward him. "The car will take you home first. I'm sure you must be tired." "Car? My driver, James, will be picking us up. Remember? I assumed I would have to find my own way home from here. Don't be ridiculous. We'll drop you off first." He steered her toward the door to the arrivals lounge, and she jerked her arm from his grip before coming to a standstill. The other first and business class passengers gave them curious looks as they streamed by. "There's no need for that. I've made alternative arrangements." His jaw tightened. "You didn't have to do that. Advertisement, it's done." He looked like he wanted to argue, but after a brief hesitation, he shrugged and strode away from her without another word. She watched him go, hating how conflicted she felt. She should feel relief that their messy little interlude was over and that he was gone, not regret and longing and pain. She followed him out into the arrivals lounge and saw her best friend almost immediately. Cal, her ex-dance partner, was easy to spot because, aside from Dante, he was one of the tallest men she knew. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else in the crowd. She saw his tousled blonde hair before he saw her 5'1" frame and black hair, which wasn't as easy to spot in a crowd of people. When he did finally see her, his handsome face broke into a huge grin, and he waved enthusiastically. Cleo fought her way past the jostling mass of people and flung herself at him. She was just so relieved to see a friendly face that she couldn't help herself. He lifted her clear off the floor. It had always been so easy for him to pick her up, and hugged her warmly, enfolding her completely in his arms. Cal was the best hugger. She clung to him, feeling safe and cocooned in his embrace, and her urgency and desperation must have been obvious because his arms tightened. "Hey, sweetheart," he muttered. "What's going on? Are you okay?" She shook her head and kept her nose buried in his neck. She loved the familiar smell of him. He put her down and gently removed her arms from his neck, wanting to see her face. "What's happened?" Damn him, he knew her too well. And everything she felt was still too fresh to hide from him. "I don't want to talk about it right now." A surreptitious glance around informed her that they'd attracted a bit of attention from passers-by, and she knew that Dante was probably close by as well. "Okay." Bless him, he was always so understanding. He looked around for her bag, a single medium-sized roller suitcase, and raised a dubious brow when he saw it. "You're such a miserly little packer. How did you survive a week in Tokyo with just that little bag?" he asked as he grabbed her elbow with one hand and the suitcase handle with the other. I didn't exactly have time to socialize. This was sufficient. I would need a bag that size for hair product alone, he said dismissively, and she giggled, surprising herself, don't I know it? Magnificence like this, he tossed his hair for emphasis, doesn't come easily. Another giggle. Cal was exactly what she needed right now. She hooked her arm through his and rested her head on his shoulder and let his nonsense chatter wash over her like a soothing balm as he led her toward where he'd parked. Dante watched Cleo leave with that blonde behemoth. She was clinging to the man's arm and staring up at him adoringly as they walked away. So much for thinking he'd hurt her back in Tokyo. He'd had an uncharacteristic flash of conscience when he'd said the things necessary to get her to sign that non-disclosure agreement. It had been dirty and unfair, but it had gotten the job done. Still, Dante wasn't a complete monster. He felt moved by her tears and even a little guilty in the face of her obvious distress. But to see her now with that guy was like watching an entirely different person, and he was glad he hadn't been completely taken in by her little girl lost act back in Tokyo. He always protected himself, condoms and non-disclosure agreements without exception. No unwanted pregnancies and no unwanted scandals. It kept things clean and uncomplicated, which was exactly the way he preferred his life. Women served a purpose, and until Cleo they had all known exactly what they were getting into with him. He was on shaky legal ground getting her to sign it the way he had, but without it he felt naked and vulnerable. Feelings he would never admit to out loud. Still, despite the fact that his bullying tactics had left a bad taste in his mouth, he couldn't regret the fact that he had stooped to them. It was over now. The document was safely signed and would be notarized as soon as possible. He had a very brief flash of regret that he wouldn't experience Cleo Knight in his bed again before he put her firmly out of his mind. Chapter 4. I don't think I've ever actually hated someone before, Cleo confessed as she licked the salt off the rim of her margarita. She paused for a moment and thought about what she'd just said. But God, I hate that man so much. The thought of seeing him again on Monday turns my stomach, and I'm so tempted to quit this job. You can't quit, hon. Cal tut-tutted. Who'll pay the rent or buy the food? Until I find a job, you're the only one keeping this boat afloat. You'll find something soon, Cal. She patted his broad shoulder a little drunkenly before going back to contemplate her curiously unsatisfying frozen margarita again. Now, can we please focus on my predicament? Okay, so the guy is a world-class asshole, Cal recapped. He treated you shabbily, which would earn him a well-deserved punch in the face if he were here right now, and you hate him but still have to work with him. Cleo nodded morosely, the pit in her stomach increasing with every word. She put aside her half-finished drink wishing she actually felt like getting rip-roaring drunk. It might have helped a little. Now, what I really want to know, Cal leaned forward conspiratorially, is he any good in the sack? Cleo sighed, he's fantastic, and that just makes me hate him more. Should I even be telling you all of this? I mean, I feel like I'm breaking that stupid contract with every syllable I utter. You probably are. Cal shrugged. But if I can trust you to keep all my sordid secrets, you could sink me if you wanted to and you know it, then you can trust me with this. And she did trust Cal, he was like a second brother to her. Her dance partner for years, he had seen her through all her trials and tribulations. He felt responsible for her fall and had been her emotional support while she'd tried to come to terms with everything she'd lost after the accident. He was the only one who truly understood. Luke didn't get it, her non-dancing friends didn't get it, but Cal got it. Cal knew what it was like to feel alive only when you were dancing, and he recognized that she felt like the most important part of her had died after the accident. He was the one who'd gotten her out of bed in the mornings, had taken her to physical therapy, had bossed her into dancing again, even though she was just a shadow of her former self. He had helped her understand that while she would never again be the supremely talented dancer who had once had dance companies vying for her attention, she could still dance. It was in her blood, a part of her physical makeup, and she would never lose it completely. All I'm saying is that the man is seriously hot, Cal said. And if he wasn't so obviously and uncompromisingly hetero, I would happily make a play for him. You're way too good for the likes of him, Cleo said. As are you, he said, completely serious. You're the best, Cal. She sighed and leaned in for a hug. He complied and she sagged against him, letting him support her slight weight. I'm so glad we're roomies, she crooned, and when he laughed, the sound had a bitter edge to it. Not exactly roomies, he corrected. More like freeloader and working stiff. You're not a freeloader, Cal. We've all been through rough spots, and you've done so much for me. She had difficulty talking around the lump in her throat. So don't you dare denigrate yourself like that in front of me again, okay? Yes, miss, he teased, making an effort to shake off his obvious depression, even though she could tell that it lingered just beneath the surface. Now tell me more. I want to know everything: length, girth, angle. Pointing downward, straight ahead, or kissing the navel? Seriously? She choked back a laugh. Well, if that thing points down, it just looks flaccid and, I dunno, incapable somehow. I'm not discussing this with you. Why not? You told me all about Frank Watts's face, remember? I did not. This is the first time I can recall us discussing the angle of any guy's erection. True, he conceded, after some thought. But that Frank guy was really boring. I wasn't interested in hearing about his antics in bed. Come on, he was nice. And boring. He was always really sweet to me. And super boring. Cleo sighed. She really couldn't argue with him. Frank Sharp, whom she dated for 2 months and slept with twice in the same night, had been a regular snooze fest. Both in bed and out of it. Cleo had actually fallen asleep during the sex act, both times. Not her finest moment. She had broken it off with him immediately after that and hadn't dated anyone else in more than a year. Dante was the first man she'd slept with since then, and poor Frank couldn't compete with that. Most men would have difficulty competing with a guy like Dante Damaso. I'm not going to discuss the matter any further, Cleo said decisively. I've probably broken a dozen of his stupid non-disclosure rules just by telling you about it. Best to let the matter rest and pretend it never happened. Cal gave her a long, level look and she dodged his gaze. He could look as skeptical as he liked. But Cleo was going to pretend it never happened if it killed her. Cleo had all weekend to think about what she would say and how she would act when she saw Dante again on Monday. She practiced her cool, slightly disdainful looks in the mirror, and her professional good morning, sir, yes, sir, no, sir, and as you wish, sir out loud every morning and evening. Yet, she was still a bundle of nerves when she walked into the office Monday morning. He must have come to the office at some point over the weekend, because even though he clearly hadn't arrived yet, there was a dictaphone full of emails she had to get ready, and 2 A4 size manila envelopes with her name sitting in the middle of her desk. She frowned at the envelopes before picking up the flatter one. She took a deep breath and stuck her finger beneath the flap to open it. The sheaf of papers inside was exactly what she'd been expecting to see, her copy of the non-disclosure agreement, officially notarized. She shook her head and shoved it back into the envelope and then into her desk drawer. Well, so much for being cool, calm, and collected this morning. One stupid envelope and she was feeling anxious and angry at the same time. Her gaze shifted to the other envelope, which was slightly bulkier than the first. She picked it up cautiously, having absolutely no clue what could be inside it. It was ridiculously light, lighter than the first envelope, and Cleo ripped it open with less care than she had the first one. She appended it and watched as a piece of paper fluttered to the desk, followed by a scrap of white cotton. She blinked at it uncomprehendingly for a few seconds before her eyes widened in recognition. She gasped, blushed, and grabbed up the Hello Kitty boy shorts in a lightning-fast move, terrified that someone would see them. Only after they were safely tucked away in her bag did she shift her attention to the paper that had accompanied the panties. Sure enough, Dante's bold, masculine writing was scrawled across the small square of paper. All it said was, "These got mixed in with my stuff." DD, Cleo crumpled the paper up in her fist and tossed it in the waste paper basket. Lovely. Just when she'd resolved to never again think of their encounter in Japan, he had to bring it all back in graphic detail without even having to be physically present. She sat down behind her desk after getting the fancy coffee machine up and running, and watering her old enemy, the ficus. She was well into the emails when Dante finally sauntered in, nearly an hour later. Completely focused on her work up until that moment, Cleo was aware of his presence almost immediately. She tensed, all her practice and preparation instantly forgotten in the face of his overwhelming presence. Good morning, Miss Knight," he inserted smoothly, before she could get a single word out. "I trust the jet lag isn't too bad?" It's... Damn. Why couldn't she speak? He waited for a moment, but when it became clear that she had nothing to offer other than that one strangled word, he cleared his throat and gestured toward the computer. "Are you nearly done with those?" She nodded mutely. "Good." He shoved his hands into his trouser pockets and rocked back slightly on his heels. Great. Why was he just standing there, staring at her? Why didn't he say something? Or leave? Or tell her to go to so-and-so's office for the rest of the day? "Peter Whitman's secretary has resigned," he said abruptly. "And I feel that the position would be more in keeping with your skill set." "Oh. It's a slight dip in salary, but you knew that you'd eventually have to take a step down, right?" "I did," she said, finally finding her voice. She stared down at her hands, spread on the keyboard in front of her, like they were the most fascinating things in the world. "Right, then. That's settled," he said a little hoarsely. "I'm not sure who Peter Whitman is," she admitted. "And when do I start?" "You'll spend the rest of the week here, but you'll start with him next Monday. He's the head of HR. I was vacillating between HR and accounting, but I thought that, since you seem to be such a people person, you'd find HR more interesting." The comment astonished her, and she raised her eyes to meet his surprisingly intense gaze head-on. His penetrating stare was a little unnerving, but she was quite touched that he had considered her personality before making his decision. "Thank you. Look, you know that this job is way beyond your actual capabilities. Right?" Why was he still talking about this? He sounded like a man who was determined to justify himself. "Well, if I didn't before, I certainly know it now," she said dryly, and his frown told her that he didn't appreciate her flippant comment. "This transfer has nothing to do with what happened between us in Tokyo." Ooh, he went there. She hadn't expected him to actually go there. It was inevitable. "I know it was," she said. "But it's rather sudden. After all, Donna is still on maternity leave. And she'll be gone for another 6 months. I can't have you here for another 6 months. You've proven yourself quite capable, but I need someone who can actually handle every aspect of the job." Of course. Weirdly, it felt like she actually had him on the back foot, and that made her feel a little more in control. "Would you like your coffee now, sir?"